Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to everyone here at Senate House and also to all of those joining us online. I trust that you can hear us well, but if that's not the case, then please do alert us in the chat. My name is Corinne Lennox. I'm a senior lecturer in human rights here at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And I'm also co-director of the Human Rights Consortium, which is co-hosting today's event. I'm pleased to say that we're co-hosting with the Minority Rights Solidarity Network, which was launched in January of this year, included by several colleagues in the room today. And its aims to bring together activists and academics working in the realm of international legal and global governance around minority rights. And it aims to be a network of cooperation, of support, of reflection on the key trends in the exercise and protection of minority rights. And we're very pleased that presently the network is hosted by the Sussex Centre for Human Rights Research. For those of you interested in the network, I've posted in the chat, if you scroll up to the top, for those joining online, you can find more details about it and also contact details of one of our members who you can reach out to for more information. That's Dr. Elizabeth Craig, who's joining us as well. So this is one of a series of events that the network has organized. Today we wanted to facilitate a discussion around decolonizing minority rights discourse. And I'm very pleased that we're able to welcome two distinguished speakers to begin the dialogue with us on this important topic. Our first speaker, Professor Mohammad Shahabuddin from Birmingham Law School, is soon to publish a journal article on decolonizing minority rights discourse in the International Journal on Minority and Group Rights. I just checked today, it's not on the events yet, so hopefully we'll see it shortly. He's going to share some insights from that paper. And then this will be followed by some comments from our discussant, Dr. Farah Mihlar, who's at Oxford Brookes University, who has also been reflecting on decolonial approaches to minority rights in her work. We'd then like to open up for a discussion, and that will include anyone joining us online as well. You'll be able to put your comments in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask a verbal question. Just to note, we are recording this session, particularly the panel presentation component, for publication later online on the School of Advanced Study website, and the discussion component will not be published online for reference. So let me just take a moment to give a more extended introduction to our two speakers. So first we have Professor Mohammad Shahabuddin, who's Professor of International Law and Human Rights and Associate Dean at Birmingham Law School, University of Birmingham. He's the author of two important books published at Cambridge University Press. The first, Ethnicity and International Law, Histories, Politics and Practices, and the second, more recently, Minorities and the Making of Post-Colonial States in International Law. His research is informed by critical post-colonial and third world approaches to international law. And he's been an expert panelist at the 14th and 15th sessions of the UN Forum on Minority Issues over the last couple of years. Our discussant, Dr. Farah Mihlar, is senior lecturer in human rights at Oxford Brookes University. She is a Sri Lankan British academic and human rights activist and has a long career working on minority rights at the international level, specializing in the issue of minorities in conflict contexts. Her current research focuses on contestations of international models of post-conflict justice by women and minority groups. And she is deeply committed to decolonizing and has recently begun to use decolonial approaches in her teaching and research. She was also an expert panelist at the 15th session of the Forum on Minority Issues last year. And I mentioned that just because we are, the global governance system does certainly come up in our discussion as well. So perhaps we'll have some insights from them on their experience there. So with that, I'd like to invite Shahab to begin with his reflections. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your extremely kind introduction. And I'm grateful to you for sacrificing your time. Hopefully you will not regret at the end of this session. And thanks also to a good number of colleagues who have joined us online. And special thanks to you, Corinne, for taking the trouble of organizing this event along with Elizabeth on behalf of both Human Rights Consortium at the University of London and very important Minority Rights Solidarity Network. Special thanks to Farah, Dr. Farah Mihlar, for committing hard time to act as a speaker and a commentator on whatever I'm going to say now. That's the difficulty. Now, I would also like to thank Tom Lantos Institute in Budapest and its director, Dr. Anna Maria Biro, for actually provoking me to take up this so-called project when they invited me to give a talk and also to help them organize a workshop, interdisciplinary workshop on decolonization and international law that took place in July this year. And actually based on that talk or keynote speech that I delivered, gradually this paper emerged, which is going to be published soon. Today I'm going to shed light on some of those ideas incorporated in that paper, and let's see whether we can generate some common themes for our discussions here in this room and also with colleagues online. Now let me begin with a quote. It says, "With the march of civilization, certain backward groups would, in the course of time, become assimilated, and it would be undesirable to insert a minority protection provision in the draft covenant which would oblige states to delay that inevitable historical process of assimilation." These are the words of the British delegate when they participated in the discussion on whether there should be a minority protection provision in international human rights covenants, which eventually ended up as International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And in both documents, there is a clear absence of any specific provision on minorities apart from Article 27 that we can talk about later. That was the British position. But what is interesting here is the way the whole story about inclusion or non-inclusion was framed within this notion of the standard of civilization. And to talk about a clear hierarchy about various civilizational groups and the obvious historical impetus for assimilation of the backward group within or into the more superior civilized nation. Now, these comments capture also the general mood of the time. I'm talking about 1950s when the comments were made regarding minority protection. Terms such as civilization and Christianizing, the anthropologist James Scott tells us, I quote, strikes the modern ear as outdated and provincial or as euphemisms for all manners of brutalities. And yet, if one substitutes the noun development, progress, modernization, it is apparent that the project under a new flag is very much alive and well. Unquote. So far as international law is concerned, in the last many decades, TOEL, which is Third World Approaches to International Law scholars, have demonstrated how colonial connotations, such as the standard of civilization or the presumed incapacity of the colonized to govern their own affairs, continued in a more subtle form to inform, shape, and govern current international law and institutions to the disadvantage of already marginalized communities. Beyond these critiques and intellectual elucidations, however, calls have been made more recently to proactively look into ways in which colonial legacies can be undone, how colonial links can be delinked, if possible at all. In other words, the agenda now is to put critiques into action. And one of the key focuses of this important decolonizing project is on the domain of knowledge production. Started in South Africa and symbolized by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement swept across academic institutions in the West, including traditionally elite ones, which directly benefited from colonialism and the slave trade. Similarly, decolonizing museums movement not only demanded the return of historical artifacts to their rightful owners in the Global South and former colonies, but also sought to recognize the integral role of empire in the creation and maintenance of museums. Scholars in a number of academic disciplines, including international law, and also including ones in core science like mathematics, they have also taken up the project of decolonizing their respective disciplinary practices. At the same time, critical voices have also been raised, questioning to what extent decolonization is possible at all, within the existing institutional structures within which these discourses are emerging. And also whether this project of decolonizing curriculum and disciplines are themselves are yet another whitewashing tool. Now, this is very much an ongoing debate, but what is more important is that scholars in the field of minority rights have taken this project seriously and have started asking questions about what the discourse of on decolonizing minority rights would look like. And it is kind of the backdrop against which I have taken up this project to engage and ask ourselves, okay, so what would that project of decolonizing minority rights would entail? And these are some of the ideas that I'm going to share with you. Now, to begin with, borrowing from Folke diversity, I use decolonization as a collection of core strategies and trajectories whose boundaries are delineated not only by manifestations of specific colonial manifestation contested, but also the structural and epistemic tools contextually available. Unquote. Thus, the decolonization project entails a series of interconnected activities and purposes seeking to fundamentally unseat colonially produced structures or coercive power and technologies of permanent disposition, and dehumanization. Translating this conception of decolonization into minority rights discourse then reveals at least two major avenues to explore the nexus between decolonization and minority rights. First, formal decolonization processes affecting minorities, and second, decolonizing minority rights discourse. Now, both of these aspects, meaning decolonization and the way it affected minorities, and secondly, decolonizing the discourse itself, these both aspects are interconnected and equally important. In my previous work, I have focused quite heavily on this connection between decolonization and its impact on minorities. But today, my focus is going to be on the second aspect, which is decolonizing minority rights discourse itself. Now, mainstream discourse on minority rights embodies a series of normative biases and assumptions which ignore the colonial underpinning of some of the core concepts, such as the very definition of the minority and the notion of minority protection. In the paper, the forthcoming paper, I argue that contemporary minority rights discourse needs to engage closely with relations of power and subaltern agency to decolonize conventional thinking within the state. I unpack this decolonizing agenda and map out what such an agenda would entail by critically analyzing 5 key areas of relevance. So that will constitute the main body of this quite long paper with more than 20,000 words. So these are the 5 themes that I have engaged quite closely and elaborately in the paper. The first, the very conception of the minority needs to be critically re-evaluated through decolonial lenses to expose a sense of otherness and backwardness embedded in the very concept of the minority. A decolonial understanding of the minority brings to the fore the questions of power relations and helps to problematize the notion of minority protection within the liberal legal architecture of minority rights that is predominant in the current discourse. And as part of this inquiry, I also analyze elements of subjectivity in the conceptualization of the minority and minority protection. Second, the continuation of colonial boundaries in post-colonial states created and aggravated the minority issue in many post-colonial states. But unsurprisingly, a standard criticism against the decolonial or decolonizing project comes in the form of an assertion that undoing colonial boundaries would cause more trouble than ameliorating or improving minority situations. While there is at least some merit in this proposition, the decolonial project cannot be sensibly reduced to the issue of colonial boundaries as a stand-alone item. Instead, the decolonizing project or agenda requires a critical examination of the reification process of the state itself in a more radical way. Thus, in this paper, I engage with a much broader notion of decolonizing the state as a prerequisite for decolonizing minority rights discourse. Third, any decolonial project must pay attention to and engage with subaltern voices and perspectives. More specifically, the agenda of decolonizing minority rights needs to mainstream the often ignored aspect of resistance by minorities. Going beyond an elitist discourse on minority rights and minority protection within institutional sites, the decolonial project demands a sharp focus on learning from grassroots practices. It is in everyday struggles of minorities to protect their lives and livelihood that actual decolonization is taking place. Their subaltern agency should therefore constitute the core of minority rights discourse. Number 4, like any decolonial project, the agenda of decolonizing minority rights needs to critically engage with the perception and the role of law in minority rights protection. The project needs to reflect on how legal concepts and categories are themselves tools of oppression. This will then help underscore the strategic use of law as a site of contestation and also explore other possible languages of resistance, such as social movements outside the domain of law. These strategic aspects of law and their role in social movements should form an important part of decolonizing contemporary minority rights discourse. And finally, as post-colonial studies and 12 have powerfully articulated, despite formal decolonization, neocolonialism, and imperialism continue to subjugate post-colonial states and peoples in many ways. Developmental ideology historically offered an avenue to make such subjugation happen from the moment of formal decolonization. Therefore, in decolonizing minority rights discourse, it is vitally important to take seriously the political economy of violence and expose how minorities suffer economic marginalization at multiple levels by powerful states, international financial institutions, post-colonial states, and national and transnational corporations. Compared to civil and political rights, this is rather an ignored area in contemporary minority rights discourse demanding adequate attention. It is to be noted here that the list of 5 key areas of relevance, which I have identified and discussed in this paper, is by no means exhaustive. I hope my takes on these themes will provoke further discussion and enrich the field of research with more innovative thoughts and ideas. So this project, in that sense, is rather a conversation starter or an invitation for further research in this field. It also needs to be acknowledged at the outset that the project of decolonizing minority rights is not a singular act. Instead, it involves a complex web of activities and a wide range of actors. So the paper that I attempted to present a brief summary of focuses on the discourse while leaving aside other important aspects of this decolonial project, such as decolonial strategies for minority rights. And an important part of this decolonizing project is active listening and attentiveness to subaltern voices. Now, I had planned to at least speak a bit in more detail about one of those areas, but I don't think that's a good idea in the time I have now. So I better stop here, and I am very much eager to listen to Farah, based on her own experience with activism, and if time permits at the end, perhaps I can return to some of those themes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahab, for giving us a sense of your paper. And I think if the discussion goes in a direction to elaborate any of those particular points, I think I'd be happy for you to fill in some more of your thinking on that. So now I'd like to invite Farah. That's a really difficult job of trying to comment on a very rich and diverse 20,000 word paper. So we're sympathetic to her for that, and we really appreciate her effort, and I look forward to her thoughts.
I shall give it my best. Thank you to the organizers for putting this really important event together, and of course Corinne, as always, for giving me the opportunity. I want to first congratulate you, Shahab, on an excellent paper which opens up debate on this very important topic at a critical moment, right, when there is sort of scope for the possibility of a new treaty, and it might be in our imaginations, but we are kind of working towards it. So it's momentous. The paper is written with much depth and analytical richness that I think only you're capable of really doing. As you know, I've also been thinking about this topic, as you've mentioned yourself, and I admire I'm quite envious actually of your boldness in producing this paper so quickly, providing us all a platform to build on, and I hope this discussion takes us forward with that. I want to say at the inception that my locus of enunciation, as we say in decolonial studies, or the position from which I speak, is colonially compromised. I have to be open and admit to it. Though I'm from a minority community and I identify as an activist, I speak and work in the English language, and I'm part of the British Academy, sadly, which, as we know, was complicit in colonialism. I also want to say that I'm aware of the references I make, for example, to the West, to Europe, to the Liberal Project, are not fixed terms and categories, and there is complexity. So I want to say, Shahab, at the beginning that I agree with quite a lot of your paper, but because of the time, I'm only going to pull out those ones that I have some contention with, right? And I'll be getting into more detail than you presented, and so I hope that those of you who have read the paper will get where I'm coming from. So, in relation, firstly, to the conceptualizing of decolonization, I was a bit curious at your selection in terms of defining decolonizing. I was wondering why you omitted leading Latin American decolonial scholars such as Aníbal Quijano and Walter Minolo. I recognize the controversies associated with some of this work, but I think Quijano's framing of coloniality as the underlying logic of colonialism, which remains epistemically and ontologically long after colonialism ended, gives us a framework to understand colonial workings beyond colonial legacies. Though I think much of your paper refers to colonial legacies, in the link you make towards the end, as you mentioned just now as well, to neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism in relation to political economy, the cycles of how this continues, you in effect cover the same ground as coloniality. But I think overall, the article could have benefited with a strong conceptual framework on decolonizing, as these are new and yet very tested theories, and I think it would have helped to clarify some of it. Additionally, I find Quijano's analysis of coloniality, which categorizes people within a hierarchy determined by the interlink between race and capital, particularly important to minorities, and I'll come to this a little later. So you start with these two avenues you identify as needing to be explored as part of decolonizing minority rights discourse, and I fully agree with your second. To put simply, that the norms and assumptions embodied in minority rights, and I would argue the regime itself, is colonially compromised. I agree with that. The first I have some issue with, that minorities are constructed as a socio-political category that needs protection. Now, I agree with your point that minorities as a socio-political category, and I would add some minority groups themselves are indeed colonial constructs. I agree with that. It's the needs protection framing that I would question. I think that's a partial view, and again, I'll develop this a little further. I found your discussion on the othering of minorities fascinating, and I appreciate your decolonial framing in this analysis. I'm not sure I was fully convinced, and I will explain this partly by nuancing it a little bit. So I think one of the issues I had was that you don't really account for the othering of the majority in the former colonies. Let me try, for experimental reasons, to try to counterframe, okay? So decolonial thinkers, especially Mihlar, in his 2009 article, Who Speaks for the Human, argues that the liberal project developed international human rights as means of continuing to maintain control of the former colonies, an extension of the civilization mission, which you alluded to as well, the first world's gift to the third world that needs to be aspired to but never possible to achieve. In other words, the liberal project is complicit in maintaining coloniality through international human rights law. Based on this geopolitical construction, the other remains the non-white, non-Christian, non-Western majority in the former colonies, right? The minority then becomes the other to the other, a second frame apart. Now, there are two ways at least we can look at this. Building on Mihlar's and Farah's work on decolonizing the human as a starting point, we could argue that if the majorities in the former colonies are seen to be less than human, the minorities could be seen to be even less than human, right? So a second frame apart. I think this is the view that some post-colonial leaders adopted when they took on aspects of coloniality and colonial legacy after independence, which is reflected in how minorities are treated in some of these countries, right? A second way to analyze this is that to the liberal project, minorities are the other to the less than human majority. By that analysis, and I borrow here from Islamic feminists who spoke similarly of the liberal project orientalizing Muslim women, minorities then move into a position of needing saving from the savage, barbaric other, i.e. the majority. So to that extent, they are a group that requires protection. I agree with you. It is here also where I find Quijano's definition of coloniality important, because in the classification of groups through the axis of capital and race, we know that colonial powers ranked them, especially minorities, at different levels. So if you take my own community back in Sri Lanka, I'm Muslim in origin, we were seen as industrious by the British, contributing to capital. So therefore, even though racially inferior, the kind of contribution to capital gave us a favored status amongst the British. So minorities, they need varying level of protection from the less than human majority, right? However, in much of the Western world, minorities are from their former colonies, like the UK, right? They are the other that wasn't successfully civilized and now enters as a threat. This is what I would argue could be the tension, that minorities are simultaneously seen as barbaric, savage, uncivilized other, who pose a threat and danger, as well as the other of the other, who are also perhaps barbaric and savage, but to a less degree and in need of protection. So I'm problematizing two things here, the analysis on othering and the argument that the liberal project framed minorities purely as needing protection. I think it misses an important point of minorities also being framed as a threat, which I would argue has limited the advancement of minority rights. I also want to touch on your decolonial critique of the definition of minorities. There are broadly two aspects to the definition of minorities within the minority rights discourse. One is the numerical component, and the second is identity. You are right that both are in relation to the majority and thereby subordinate. But you don't dwell on the numerical aspect of the definition. And I'm interested in exploring what does this offer in terms of coloniality. I think from the decolonial perspective, while it's important, as you do, to problematize coloniality within the definition of minorities, the reference to non-dominant groups is extremely important and I would say empowering. From the decolonial ethos of dislocating dominant power structures, this non-dominant position, both of minorities and the minority rights regime vis-à-vis international human rights framework enables us to genuinely engage in decoloniality. I think it's an opportunity. Similarly, I think a point you miss is a holistic presentation of the minority rights framework. When you refer to the, I'm quoting here from the paper, the liberal way of minority protection suppressing ethnicity through the individualist principles of equality and non-discrimination, I would counter this by arguing that the right to identity is considered one of the core pillars of minority rights. I think it's very interesting because I see the two pillars of participation and non-discrimination. Non-discrimination is what you refer to in your paper, participation and non-discrimination, tainted in coloniality. And whilst we can see aspects of the same in the pillars of the right to existence and right to identity, so the four core pillars of minority rights, I think these reflect the shaping of minority rights discourse by non-dominant groups. This also links to your point on agency subjectivity, and I completely agree that supportive resistance needs to be at the heart of decolonizing minority rights discourse. So I would kind of challenge some of that framing with the recognition that the right to identity is a core pillar in minority rights, and what does that mean in terms of the coloniality framing of the liberal project, right? Finally, I fully agree with your argument in relation to the state and international law. And I think your points about not conforming minority rights discourse to status framework and critically reevaluating the role of law are interesting. And I'd really like to hear more from the audience about this. It has certainly given me a lot to think about, and I would add to these two factors it's the relationship of minority rights to the international human rights framework. So not just international law, but the international human rights framework itself. There is now an abundance of literature on coloniality within this framework. And to me, the real elephant in the room is in relation to universality, which decolonial scholars would argue represents a totality of truth and knowledge of a dominant group. But then I have great difficulty with their proposal of pluriversality, which I think could be quite dangerous for minorities, right? So this is, I think, an area that there is a lot of scope for those of us who are working on decolonizing minority rights to consider how through a minority rights framework, and particularly through minorities' non-dominant position, we might be able to perhaps think through what universality means. And then I just want, I'm very grateful to you starting the presentation by bringing up the kind of problems with this whole decolonizing project taking place in elite places like this, and I have great difficulty with this. And I think that we need to really be open and honest about it, because my concern is not only that we will whitewash it, but I'm also afraid that we may impose our superior expert knowledge on communities that may not be necessarily talking and thinking about decolonizing. And in my work as an activist in communities, I have not come across much conversation on decolonizing, and I think that there's a lot of critique of the international system, certainly, but that doesn't mean decolonizing. And then if I have to practically think about how we can do this, I cannot see a way of doing it except to go and explain what we're trying to do. And then I think that reaches very dangerous territory of trying to impose something and pretty much colonizing once again. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah, for those publications and for looking in detail at Shahab's paper. Would you like to respond quickly to any of the points made by Farah?
Yeah, I think that would help with generating more focused thematic discussion.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Farah, for taking the time to read the paper closely. It's a really, really long paper. As I said, more than 20, I think to be specific, 21,500 something. So they've been very generous to accept as it is without asking you to chop it down, because their policy was like, I think, 13,000 max. So they've been very generous. I wholeheartedly agree with most of the, actually all of the things that you say, but I think for the sake of clarity, and since we have this opportunity of engaging directly and just reading each other's work, I would like to make few observations, not observation, basically to give you a bit more about the background story. And I think that's one of the few advantages of engaging with the author directly. So I started this paper on the basis of certain assumptions. If not assumptions, I would say based on what already exists in the field. So as part of the context, I myself is part of this TOEL network, Third World Approaches to International Law, which is here for last few decades, and perhaps I belong to the third generation of TOELers. There were second generation, Sri Lankan scholar, Basuki Nisaya, Anthony Yankee, Indian, based Indian, everyone. And there was also 12-1 immediately after the moment of decolonization. One thing that is, and TOEL as a scholarship, Third World Approaches to International Law, it heavily relies on post-colonial scholarship. And the idea that is almost given in the TOEL scholarship is, okay, so there was colonialism, which is different from colonial rule per se, right? So the colonialism here focuses more on the ideology that informs that colonial rule, meaning this whole notion of standard of civilization, the whole assumption that some people are not simply capable of governing their own affairs. Now, as a result of colonial rule, there are certain persistent colonial legacies which continue to shape everyday life. So that is about colonial legacy in a direct way, but the big portion of post-colonial scholarship which heavily influenced TOEL scholarship is actually based on the idea of coloniality, which would be the term, more popular term in the Latin American context. And it is there for a long period of time. It's nothing new. The idea that the underlying assumption, the ethos, the ideology, which is different from the colonial legacy of a particular act. For example, this is what colonial rule under British was done to India, and this is the direct result of that. So one good example there would be the electoral politics, how Indian politics was bifurcated and leading to partition based on what the British colonial administration did. That would be an example of colonial legacy. But when we talk about imperialism of our time, when we think about the whole human rights discourse as part of standard of civilization, when you talk about the development discourse as part of standard of civilization, that is the coloniality we're talking about. And it is there for last many decades. So my paper based on that assumption as part of that TOEL literature as part of that. So this idea of coloniality or colonialism, however you put it, and I fully agree with you, is something more than colonial legacy. It is this ideological aspect. The underlying assumption that some people are not simply capable of governing their own affairs, right? So the current discourse on failed state, rogue states, these are very much product of that mentality, right? The net exporters of economic migrants, right? Just put people on boards and they somehow. So the whole discourse is based on this idea of coloniality, colonialism, however you frame it. So I work very much within that framework. And therefore, the dilemma was to what extent I can re-narrate what exists, because there's a kind of thick literature in this field. So the conscious decision was not to torture my readers with another few thousand words, which would have been, now on hindsight, I feel, would have been more useful to give the context to make it a complete thing, but can a paper really be that complete? But I think this is a useful opportunity for me to talk about that context, because this idea of colonialism, which I take very seriously, and that is the single most important thing that informs TOEL scholarship. If you read any TOEL scholarly work, that is something that will jump up immediately. This is something more than colonial legacy, and I think it is very important that we take Farah's point seriously, that when we talk about colonial discourse, it is not just colonial legacy. It is that assumption that made, don't forget, colonial project was legal. Colonial project was justified, morally, ethically, right? When there were difficult questions in British Parliament regarding what is the moral justification, in Victorian time, the best of British values, right? Discourse regarding what is the moral justification for subjugating people in alien territories. The answer was, it's an ethical project because because it's a civilized mission. We are giving civilization, the light and darkness. Sounds familiar, right? These days, that kind of discourse, right? So it is this assumption, this colonialism, right, which is different from colonial act or colonial legacy or colonial rule. That is important. Second point, again, I cannot agree more. Different layers of othering. And actually, in my PhD at the first book, Ethnicity International Law, I have done exactly that, which is the whole colonial project and colonialism was, as I said before, was justified as a project of othering. Otherwise, how do you justify, make it legal with scientific backing, like social Darwinist idea, and translate it into international law, right? How you justify that? You justify that by this process of othering, that some people are not capable of governing their own affairs. You invent the lack. They don't have law, they don't have culture, they don't have art, they don't have civilization, right? And then you give each of those. You give a particular model of law, particular model of governance, particular model of thinking about society, particular model of civilization, and then people are accepted to the fold of international society, right? That is how international law evolved over a long period of time. And I'm not just talking about 19th century moment of science or race. If you go back to Francisco Vitoria moment, like 16th, 15th century, the same language was there at that time using the language of ethics and morality, law of nature. So it is this process of othering at a macro level. And then within those communities, then you have another additional layer of minorities which are being othered, not only by the colonial administration, which is far more complex, I agree, because the dividend rule played a key role in not only creating minorities, but also minority favoritism. There is an Indian scholar, anthropologist, who made some wonderful anthropological research on British response to Indian minorities and how those minorities are classified. It's a fascinating study. So that some minorities are seen very useful, right? And some minorities are seen kind of like unruly, based on who collaborates, who doesn't. And so therefore, various minorities had a very ambiguous relationship with colonial administration. And they paid heavy price for them. The moment colonial regimes left, those minorities now had to reconcile their relationship because those were seen as betrayers, the loyalists to the British rule. The Rohingya minority would be a classic example. It's a classic example, given their relationship with the British, during the Japanese invasion of Myanmar during the Second World War. So it's a very complex story. But the process of othering is given, othering not only by the colonial administration, but in the contemporary setup, othering by the majority of the majoritarian state. So I fully agree with Farah that there are multiple layers of othering. But the focus in this project, actually throughout my scholarship, is on the minority side specifically, rather than getting too much into the macro level of othering, the very coloniality or colonialism, for a good reason. And if there is anyone, I see a couple of international lawyers within that royal genre, the answer would be quite obvious. Historically, there is a very strong bias within royal scholarship that predominantly focus on that macro level of othering. So most of the royal scholarship, as you see, is directed towards the colonial phenomenon and how it created that othering vis-a-vis the post-colonial state. And many of them will continue to talk about present-day problems as part of that colonialism, right? Not only legacy, the phenomenon. They hardly engaged, especially the Royal one. It is only during 12-2, and only very few people, they took up this project of non-state actors within post-colonial states seriously. Most Royal scholarship focus on the agency of the third world state and how it is being vulnerable to global north subjugation And that actually was the primary motivation, at least 15 years back, why I decided to focus on the minority point, which was heavily ignored within that extremely critical, extremely wonderful body of scholarship that focused heavily on the global north and the global south. But it ignored to a great extent, with some bright exceptions, subordinate entities and non-state actors within those post-colonial states. And for me, it was important because here we are talking about multi-layers of subjugation, global north, global south, but also global post-colonial states themselves oppressing minorities as part of the ideological manifestation of the post-colonial state itself. I think I should stop here, but thank you so much, Farah, for your very insightful comments. And if I have to write this paper again, I think thanks to you, I'm going to do it slightly different. Thank you.
Thank you so much.